Hey guys, welcome to Solo ReacTalk. Today I'm going to be reacting to Sex, Drugs and the Right to Vote Between Two Wars, 1920, Part 4 of 4 by Time Ghost History. You can check out my previous reactions to other Between Two Wars videos. Remember the playlist card will be at the top. Just click on it and you'll be able to access them. Okay, let's start. 3, 2, 1, go.
In 1918, when the men from the front lines of the World War began returning home, they brought with them some very troubling stowaway passengers, venereal disease and drug addiction. When they arrived home, they found a new generation of women vocally proclaiming their expectation of a gender equality in a way that most women would not have dared to only 4 years earlier. And all those three things would, rather bizarrely, come together and change the world. Welcome to Between Two Wars, a chronological summary of the interwar years covering all facets of life, the uncertainty, hedonism, and euphoria, and ultimately humanity's descent into the darkness of the Second World War. I'm Indy Nidell. This year, 1920, the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution is ratified August 19th, giving women there the vote. Now, in Great Britain, some women were given the vote 2 years earlier. Germany introduced universal suffrage immediately after the war during the German Revolution.
Wait, what does he mean by some women? Some women were eligible to vote. What about the rest? Is he saying important, rich, probably nobility women were able to vote while the rest who were working class or poor were not allowed to vote?
And many other nations are about to or have already followed suit. There is literally a tsunami of change rolling over at least the Western world and some parts of the Middle East. This isn't a sudden development though. Women have been fighting for the vote for many decades at this point. But before 1914, in most parts of the world, this was still a movement facing formidable opposition, not only from men, but also from many women. In the last 100 years, both women and men have gained access to better education, and a foreseeable and natural desire to have a say in the world has grown. The 1850s sees a massive awakening of political awareness among women in many parts of the world. At the turn of the century in Egypt, the women's liberation movement has become an essential part of the nationalist independence movement, as we saw in our previous episode. In England and the US, the suffragettes are not only fighting for the vote, but for more rights in all aspects of society. In Sweden and Norway, the battle for women's rights becomes an integral part of the socialist movement, and so on. Sure, there are places like New Zealand, Australia, and Finland where women could vote in national elections before the war. And actually, the Pitcairn Islands had women's suffrage since 1838. And you have to go look up why after watching this episode, because it's cool. But until the First World War, the suffragettes, for the most part, only make limited progress and face almost impossible resistance. For instance, the 19th Amendment was introduced to the U.S. Congress already in 1878 by Senator Aaron A. Sargent. But there's so much resistance to women having the vote that it takes 41 years before they get enough votes together to pass it. But with mounting pressure arising during and after the World War, in 1919, it's finally passed and sent to the individual states for ratification. 1 year later, it's adopted. The struggle for the vote goes through similar hardships all over the world, and in many places, it will still take time before it happens. But why is this such a big deal? The simple answer would be to say that women are viewed as less mentally capable than men. It's certainly one of the arguments often given by the opponents to women's suffrage at the time.
Yeah, the patriarchal system was still very, very strong during those times. And even today in some countries, even though women might have the eligibility to vote, we still have these patriarchal families, which then in turn create a patriarchal society. It still continues where women are not seen as equal people to men. They're seen as very emotional or not very intelligent. They're meant to be stuck in this one-dimensional existence where they either have to be the mother, the caregiver, the person who stays at home, the person who makes the food, and who does all that stuff. When women, just like men, can be multifaceted, they can do many things. There's nothing holding them back but men and their fear of losing control over women. That's the main crock issue, So yeah, we still have a long way to go in terms of gender equality across the world, especially when it comes to our religions. Those institutions are one of the institutions of patriarchal dominance. That's something that has to be fought generationally. It has to keep churning, keep moving, where we fight for women's rights and emancipation, and for gender equality. So yeah.
However, there are other more significant reasons, and they have a lot to do with sex. Not sex as in gender, but sex as in the intimate relations between women and men. Now, bear with me here while I deviate briefly into sex ed from a historical perspective. Some of this might seem obvious, but it is important to the topic. As most of you hopefully know, two possible side effects of having sex are pregnancy and venereal disease. While the latter is universally undesirable, the former is often very welcome, but not always. The future of humanity depends on having sex, and we've been endowed by nature to enjoy it so that we do it, to the point that most of us have a hard time not doing it, right? Now, think of what that means for women who have no access to contraception, or perhaps feel that it's wrong to use contraception. It means having babies, and not getting a baby, but many babies, which is great for the survival of the species when infant mortality is high, but for women as individuals throughout history, it hasn't been so great. Either they were pregnant or nursing or both, effectively excluding them at least part of the time from fully participating in society. Ingeniously, we worked out pretty early on how to use contraceptives and alleviated the situation somewhat. But it won't be until the pill is introduced in the 1960s that there is a truly effective way of preventing conception. Before that, there's a big chance that even if you don't want to, even if you do use contraception, you'll get a baby. A child that needs to be taken care of, nourished, and raised for years. Our solution to that is pretty much built in our general nature of pairing up with the opposite sex, which has been formalized in family structures. And there you have the root reason for oppression of women in the 19th and 20th century. Some people, many people actually, see women's liberation as a threat to the core family, which by their argument would lead to a world full of children without fathers, or maybe even mothers, to raise them. And it's not just the vote that they think will threaten the delicate balance of man and woman in matrimony. Contraceptives could as well. The argument is that when women and men can just have as much sex as they want to without worrying about pregnancy, they will. And this will break up marriages and again lead to a bunch of kids without anyone to raise them. So no contraceptives it is. Now, they believe this fixes that second problem as well. When men and women only have sex within marriage, they won't get the clap, especially not if they abstain from sex before marriage, ideally. And remember that before Pasteur and others discover how contagious diseases work, there's not even any knowledge for how to prevent catching something, anything. As a result, venereal disease has long been a scourge of humanity with, for instance, syphilis, infecting hundreds of millions of people over centuries until a cure is finally discovered in 1905. By the mid-19th century, there's no cure, but they've at least worked out how it could be prevented. And it is now clear that a condom is a good way not only to prevent pregnancy, but also to stop the spread of venereal disease. Okay, contraception, whether effective or not, had been practiced since antiquity, and linen or animal product condoms in use for a couple of centuries, but not widely, being unaffordable or unavailable to the masses, and not especially effective since they often had holes, broke, or came off until the introduction of vulcanized rubber. But condom use.
This is very interesting. The origins of condoms. They were made out of fabrics and linen and all these other types of material that's not related to rubber. That's very interesting. Okay.
would still be a problem for those opposed to more relaxed sexual behavior in society. And let's be clear here, it's not just about saving marriages. There's a whole bunch of ideological, religious, and erroneous medical arguments in place, some of which are an issue to this day. However, before the 18th century, these issues are not only not fully understood, they're also pretty immaterial. At the beginning of the 18th century, 60% of all children born in England will die before they reach reproductive age. So the survival of the species depends on having many babies. Now, this starts to change, especially in Europe, by the end of the 1700s, when infant mortality is dropping as healthcare and standards of living increase. By the end of the 19th century, infant mortality in England will have dropped to 20%. By comparison, in 2018, it's 1.2%. Also, urbanization is bringing more and more people together, creating greater opportunities for more and more people for sexual encounters of the non-marriage kind. This does not go unnoticed by the thinkers of the time. The controversial English cleric and scholar Thomas Robert Malthus is tremendously worried about overpopulation. He foresees a catastrophic population increase that will lead to a global collapse of society as food runs out and resources become scarce sometime in the first half of the 19th century. Luckily for humanity, his calculations are way off the mark and fail to take full account of technological advances in agriculture and manufacturing, but that's another story. In any case, in his 1798 publication, An Essay on the Principle of Population, he proposes that birth control should be one of the solutions to avoid the pending disaster. Malthus not only proposes contraception as a solution, he even goes so far as advocating research into safer abortions to allow women the right of choice both before and after sex. Well, he also proposes celibacy, monogamy, and abstention, increasing food production, preventing wars, and much more. It's sort of a whole tool shed full of weapons to combat overpopulation. In any case, many other scholars have similar ideas around the same time, and this sets off a controversial discussion that is still going on to this day: the right for women to choose pregnancy and even terminate it. And there we have it. The movement for women's liberation is closely linked to the right to choose and to sex education. During the 19th century, this becomes an organized movement in the US, Britain, Scandinavia, and many other parts of Western Europe, especially focused on lower-income families that suffer from higher birth rates, leading to children they cannot afford to bring up. On the way, it becomes clear that to see change in these areas, the very people that are most affected, women, need to have a say in society. You see, the protective measures to stop people from having sex outside of marriage have been codified into law, prohibiting abortions, the sale of contraceptives, and even sex education. In many places, breaking these laws won't just give you a fine, you'll go to prison. That is exactly what happens to Margaret Sanger, one of the pioneers of sex ed and birth control in the United States. Inspired by a visit to Holland, she opens a family planning and birth control clinic in New York in 1915. It lasts 9 days before she's arrested. She's sentenced to 30 days in a correctional facility, but when released, she carries on. Repeated arrests follow, and at her conviction, the judge concludes that women do not have, quote, the right to copulate with a feeling of security that there will be no resulting conception. But Sanger prevails, and on appeal, her conviction is overturned, and this opens the way for the prescription of contraceptives in the US as of 1918. It's probably no coincidence that this decision comes in 1918. The war has radically overturned the concept of gender roles and the views on contraception. As men fight at the front, women step in and take over what were previously unthinkable jobs for a woman, like soldering, construction, trucking. A return to the pre-war gender-segregated society is not an option. But the war also brings changes in the area of sex, which brings us back to venereal disease. There's this idea that many young men left for the war and died on the battlefields as virgins. Nothing could be further from the truth. If they were virgins when they left, they most probably were not by the time they arrived at the front. If you didn't have the luck to meet a local girl the normal way, there were plenty of other options. On all of the fronts and on all sides, brothels are not only tolerated, but systematically organized and in some cases regulated by the armies to keep them as clean and healthy as possible. But the customs of the nation's armies make for different ways of handling the inevitable fact that young fighting men facing potential death will do whatever they can to get some comfort and solace in the arms of another. The French have already been issuing condoms to the troops to combat disease and stop unwanted pregnancies as a standard part of equipment since the end of the 19th century. The Germans, the Russians, the Austrians, the Italians, all of them are handing out condoms. The only nations to not do so, for reasons of morality, are the nations of the Commonwealth and the United States, with catastrophic consequences. During the war, 416,891 British soldiers are admitted to hospital for treatment of venereal disease. That's roughly 5% of all men enlisted in the entire British forces. Compare that to 74,711 cases of the more talked about condition, trench foot. Canadian soldiers, who are better paid than their English counterparts, for example, and thus can afford more visits to the joy houses and also cannot go home to their sweethearts on their leave, are even worse off. In 1915, they have a VD infection rate of 22%. Consider also the amount of cases of VD that were not treated. Some diseases like chlamydia or syphilis present little or no symptoms initially. Then there's the embarrassment, the shame that stops many from even seeking treatment. And although many other armies are handing out condoms, that's still not a perfect solution. First of all, you actually have to use them. And even if you do, in the 19-teens, condoms are less than perfect. So they bring the diseases back home with predictable results. But that's not the only thing they come back with. Wounded, psychologically scarred, and treated by liberal prescriptions of cocaine and heroin, they return home addicted to what is still at the time viewed as acceptable prescription pain medication. Now, the use of heroin and cocaine for recreational purposes has been widespread for decades already, but with masses of soldiers hooked, usage spreads like an epidemic. The authorities around the world realize they've created a serious problem, killing and disabling young people by the thousands. Already in the year 1920, U.S. lawmakers passed more restrictive laws on the prescription of opiates and cocaine, and heroin is banned outright in the U.S. in 1924. Now, think about this for a moment. Here we are in 1920, and there's a young generation who have watched millions of their generation die in the war and of the Spanish flu. The young men have lost their innocence on the front lines and in the brothels of Europe. The women have discovered that they can be an equal contribution to the workforce. They are, as Hemingway put it, the lost generation, but also the resilient generation. Many of them will now change the way the world works and launch a decade that is characterized by an uninhibited celebration of lust and the right to individual self-determination. Sex is right at the center of this youth revolution, or as Samuel D. Schmalhausen will put it in the article Sex Among the Moderns in the Birth Control Review of October 1928, sexual love as happy recreation is the clean new ideal of a young generation sick of duplicity and morals, sham and marital insincerity, and general erotic emptiness. A hygienic ideal, cleansed of hypocrisy, free from the misery of repression, is capturing the awakened minds of an increasing number of men and women. Passion, radiantly humanized by compassion, is our enriching new ideal.
Imagine they had TikTok in those days. Hey! It would have been so interesting.
Well, perhaps that was a bit over the top, but you get the idea. Sadly, this youth revolution will not end well. It will take until the 1960s and the introduction of the contraceptive pill for it to truly take off and achieve significant change. In 1920, for many, it's an outrage, a violation of the natural order, and they see it as one of the root causes of all the troubles in the world. The more benign reactions in that direction will create a new social conservative surge in the West. In the more extreme cases, it will provoke a violent reactionary drive to return to a society where a man is the provider, the woman takes care of the household, and breeds children for the advancement of the race, or as the Nazis will put it, to produce a child for the Fuhrer. that very Fuhrer will not only attack the freedom of youth, women, political opponents, and other ethnicities, but also subjugate entire nations by war. The first of these will be Poland. That's where we will go back to in our next episode when we look at the underlying conflicts between Germany and Poland that lead to war in 1939. To get our episodes ahead of time and support the effort to make more content like this, join the Time Ghost Army on Patreon or directly at our timeghost.tv website. There, you can also sign up for our forum for free. And if you have not already, subscribe.
Okay, pause. I just need to know, what is that thing behind him? That blue structure with all the images and paintings on it. What is it? Is it a closet or is it something else? I'm not entirely sure, but I've been looking at it like for the past, like since the very beginning. I just never took interest into it until now. Really, I need to know what is that behind him. Okay.
The Time Ghost and World War II on YouTube. World War II Week by Week starts September 1st, 2018. Now, if you missed the episode of Between Two Wars about the Spanish flu, click right here for that. And as Spike Milligan said, contraceptives should be used at every conceivable occasion. You get it, right? It's funny, right? All right, well, here's to you, Spike. See you next time.
Okay, guys, that was Sex, Drugs, and the Right to Vote Between Two Wars, 1920, Part 4 of 4. Yes, you know, when society changes, it can become very frightening for some people. Their whole world was based on this ideal that they believed was the right thing. And then all of a sudden, you know, after a terrible war, after a disease-ridden society, you know, things start to change and things that don't look the same anymore. Things are not the same anymore in terms of how we react or how we interact with other people. Just like how it is right now in our present day. You know, like after the coronavirus, things have started to change a bit in society. I see people wearing masks, you know, as a daily thing now. It's not just the thing of, oh, okay, there's a virus, let me just put on this mask because it's instituted by government as a law. No, people are just doing it as a regular basis thing, you know, and washing their hands more often with detergents and other forms of liquid soap. So, you know, habits change, beliefs change, and even morality starts to bend and flex itself and transform itself into something else. So, you know, those who are stuck in their comfort zone find it very, very hard to accept change. Especially if it's men who have been the head of the household, you know, who have been told since they were young that a man should be this, a man should do that, a woman should be this, a woman should be that. It's very hard for them to accept that those ideals are now archaic. They are things of the past, and they are things that can no longer be used in our present time. So yeah, in terms of the equality of females and men in our world, really, that was something that was very, very important that should happen, and it should continue to happen even in today. Like I said before, that patriarchy is still well and alive throughout most of the world, where in family structures it's usually the man who has to be the one who has to be the breadwinner, who has to be the one going to work and doing all of these things to get money for the family, while the wife stays with the children. She is only the person who takes care of children and clean the house and cook the food. You know, there's still that kind of expectation of the gender roles, as we've been told, you know, gender roles of men and women. So these are the type of things that still need to be uneducated, if I can say that, in our societies. And contraceptives are still viewed in some countries as something that you don't really need, especially if you're having sex with your significant other, with your wife or with your husband. You don't need to have contraceptives. You don't need to have a condom. You don't have to have protected sex. These are the type of things that still exist even today. And these are very important tools, if I can call them that, for the protection of not only yourself but your partner or your multiple partners that you may have, and people who are infected with these diseases, these sexually transmitted diseases. They still keep it to themselves. They don't tell anybody. They're ashamed to go to the hospital or to the clinic. In some countries, in my country, in South Africa, we have one of the highest HIV rates, mainly because the lack of education in terms of sexually transmitted diseases, or we don't have the education in safe sex, and it's still very much of a taboo topic, amongst our people, especially when it comes to the parent telling the child. Usually they're expecting the teacher to be the one to be telling the child about these kind of things, when also the parent, him or herself, has to be the one to sit down with their child and explain to them about your sexual changes, your sexual maturity, and what do you need to do, what do you need to be in terms of a responsible human being who is sexually active. So there is still a lot of societal changes that need to occur for there to be a true emancipation, a true equality of men and women in society. And this episode was also very, very interesting. And also the evolution of condoms. That was very interesting. I think I'm going to go on YouTube and search for any other documentaries that can, give me information on the evolution of condoms, because that's quite interesting, that they used to use cloths and linens, as a condom before they used the rubber. So it's quite interesting. I think I'm going to look out for some videos about that. But yes, guys, that's it for today. If you like the video, please give me a like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. Click on the notification bell if you want to be up to date with my latest videos. And I will see you next time. Okay?